Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's talk Inside the Page. My name is Roberta Watson, and on behalf of Jefferson's Office of Alumni Relations, I want to welcome you. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Madi Sinha, who prefers to be called Madi, and Maria Poluch. Dr. Sinha, Madi, is a practicing physician and now a published author, and Maria is a second-year student at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College, along with our student representative for the SKMC Alumni Association. Tonight, in a conversation-style interview, they'll be exploring what it's like to write a book, how to find an agent, what the publishing process looks like, and share some scoop behind the White Coat Diaries, Madi's debut novel. Following their conversation, we will get to your questions in a Q&A. So I encourage you to submit those throughout the program using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Maria and Madi to get us started. Thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to this.
Thank you, Roberta. It's great to be here. And thank you, Madi, for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Maria, for taking time out of what I know is a busy med student schedule. And thank you to the Alumni Association for having me.
So I'm going to start by just giving a little introduction so people know your background. So Madi Sinha is a practicing physician who trained at Jefferson, as well as a published writer. She is a faculty member at Jefferson and currently lives in New Jersey with her husband and 2 children. Madi is the author of The White Coat Diaries, which is her first novel published in September of 2020. So the way that I kind of have the question structured is like going from general, just talking about you getting involved in the writing process, and then a little bit more specifically for people who are interested in like the logistics of publishing a book.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. So can you begin by telling us a little bit about your background and your interest in writing, like when that all sparked and started?
Yeah, so I've always been a writer. I've always kind of just done that as a hobby. And I never really took it seriously. I took some writing courses in college, but never thought that it was something I was going to pursue. I was kind of thought in the back of my mind that it would be something I did after I retired. And then it just kind of ended up working out. I ended up starting this book when I was pregnant with my first child, and I just needed something to occupy myself. And yeah, one thing led to another, and it just ended up working out.
That's awesome. Did you still write in med school and residency a little bit on the side? Like, was it a hobby that you kept throughout the years?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there's ever been a time, like I can remember being like 7 years old and like keeping a little diary. And I don't think there's ever been a time where I haven't found comfort in writing. So it's definitely something I did in med school just to kind of de-stress from all the pressure of med school.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what was the inspiration for this book?
So it was based on my own intern year. So I did my internship back in 2002 at a hospital in Northeast Philadelphia that no longer exists. And it wasn't the greatest experience. I mean, it was a really formative experience for me. I was young, I was in my 20s, and this was my first like real job. And as you know, the intern year, it sort of takes you from, book learning to all of a sudden, you're the doctor and you're responsible for these decisions. And the program that I was at was on probation that year, which was something I did not know when I applied to it. So we had, it wasn't the best run program. So as a result, we ended up as interns in a lot of situations that we probably should not have been in unsupervised. So I had this sort of wealth of experiences at the end of that year. And it's weird because the intern year, it's such a dynamic year. So many things happen. You grow so much. You grow from really not knowing very much at all to sort of at the end of the year, having gone through all of these experiences and knowing how to run a code by yourself and all of these things, have changed for you. And then at the end of the year, and, you've bonded with the people that you work with. And at the end of the year, it's just over one day. One day you just walk out of the hospital and you say goodbye to all these people and you move on to the next phase of your career. And I walked out of the hospital on the last day and I was like, wait, what? Like, that's it? Like, we're not going to talk about what happened here or process any of this that happened. And I did what I do, which is I kept a little journal of all of the things that had happened that year. And I had like in the back of my mind this idea that someday I'm going to write about this. And more because I wanted it to mean something. I wanted it to mean more than just, it was this year out of my life. It felt like all of these really big things that happened, and I wanted to make some sense out of that. So I put that notebook aside with all of these experiences in it, and I didn't get it out for many years later. It was 2010 before I got the notebook out again, and thought, maybe I could do something with this. And I started writing this, what I thought was going to be a memoir, and ended up being a novel.
Yeah, I loved reading it. I mean, there's not many books that like kind of talk about internee or medicine in general, especially from the perspective of a female. And it's nice that it's fiction as well, and like, but still felt very relatable and real and exciting, kind of, because you painted medicine in like a pretty good picture, and the ending kind of like leaves you hanging. I won't give it away for people who haven't read it, but it's so good. So I appreciate you writing it.
Oh, thank you so much. That means the world.
Yeah. So there was like a definite cultural aspect of the book, and I was just wondering if you could speak more to how that was to put onto paper, because it was really interesting to like hear that perspective as well when I was reading the book.
Yeah, so that's like an interesting journey. So when I wrote the book, the main character was not Indian American. It was a white main character, and that was because that was all I'd seen. So I was writing in the women's fiction genre. It was a young woman's voice. It was a first person narrator, and I had never read a book with a first person narrator that was about this, young woman getting a job in a city and like going through this formative experience. That's a whole genre of a novel, right? It's a whole type of subset of novels. So what we sometimes, tongue in cheek called chick lit, which I don't love that term. It's basically women's fiction about a young woman going through a formative time in her life. And so you think of books like The Nanny Diaries or The Devil Wears Prada. Those are the big ones in that genre. And I wanted to write something that had a similar feel to it. And I'd never seen anything like that. Back in 2010, there were no books like that were told from a South Asian woman's perspective. So in my mind, I thought, well, that just can't be. So I'm just going to write what I know, what I've seen, what I've read. And I wrote this character who, I showed that book to a friend of mine, and she's South Asian, and she like read it at a gas station and called me and was like, I don't understand why this book isn't about a South Asian woman. Like, why are you not writing about a South Asian woman? I said, I don't know how to do that. And she said, it doesn't have to be a book about being South Asian, which is what I was used to seeing. Books by South Asian people about South Asian people are about the experience of being South Asian, about, the cultural difficulties and arranged marriage and all the things we, sort of stereotypically associate with being South Asian. And, she said to me, and I'm forever grateful to her, it doesn't have to be about her being South Asian. Just make her South Asian, because why not? Like, why wouldn't that be something that you wanted to put out into the world? And the more I thought about that, the more sense that made to me. And when I changed that character to South Asian, I gave her a South Asian family that I based very loosely on my own family. They're not related to my family. I have to say that they're not characters that are directly related to people I know. They're just very loosely based on people I know. The voice of the character became so much more real and authentic, and I connected to the story so much more. So I'm really proud of that aspect of the book and how that ended up.
Yeah, that's awesome. You did it so well. Like, it didn't feel, it felt very authentic the whole time I was reading it. And also was nice to like be exposed to that as well. So yeah, that was awesome that you did that.
I feel strong that we just need to see more, voices represented from all across the spectrum of, of experience and background. And I'm proud to be somebody that's adding to that body of work.
Yeah, that's amazing. Did the book evolve a lot? Like, did it go through a lot of revisions when you were writing it? Because it sounds like you named kind of like one, but I'm wondering if there was like a lot of like logistical revisions and like editing versions.
Yeah, like 100%. So I probably rewrote this book like 11 times before it was done. And, so I started out sort of thinking it was going to be a memoir, and then it very quickly became clear that my real life is not nearly interesting enough to, fill an entire book. So, that's where I drew from like other experiences and created this fictional world. But but yeah, the story was a much simpler story when it started out. And I sort of like, had to educate myself about how to write a novel because I'd never taken a class, about that before. I never really like tried to write a novel before. This was the first novel I ever attempted. So as I was writing it, I was sort of reading up on, style books and reading up on how to plot a novel. And so I just kept going back and revising the book. And it is very different in its final form than those early first drafts, for sure.
Yeah. So did you take a class for it, or did you end up like just kind of doing your own research on the side, or did you have like trusted people who were already in the industry that helped you out?
I didn't know anybody in the industry. I took a class at Temple online for like 6 weeks. It was called Writing to Get Published. And it was great. It was like a good introduction to some of like the terminology that's used by writers to talk about the writing and the editing process. And that was a good start, but it certainly wasn't enough. So I had to, read on my own and, find style books. And there are some great resources online that I tapped into and just, kept trying and failing. And then, eventually had this finished product that was, that I was proud of, that I felt like was the best work I could do.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So now I'm going to transition a little bit more into more of the logistics of getting the book actually published for any alumni or students who might have an interest in doing this on the side as well. So how did you look for an agent?
So
yes, did you use an agent?
So one thing that I forgot to mention, Maria, that I feel like is really important to mention about how I like learned how to write novels is that I did at the end, sort of like at the tail end of like 2017, after I'd worked on the novel for several years, I did end up working with a developmental editor. And it was through this website. It's called Revise and Resub. So if you just type into Google, Revise and Resub, not resubmit, but Revise and Resub, they are a group of editors and they run a contest every year called RevPit. It's a Twitter contest, and you submit your manuscript, and if you get chosen, you get to work with a developmental editor for 6 weeks for free. And I was lucky enough to win that contest. And the experience of working with an editor was so valuable. It was the single most valuable thing that I did. So I definitely want to mention that because that was huge for me. I went so far as I could on my own, and then the editor was incredibly helpful in teaching me like the things that I just had missed. So once I did that, and I'd gone through that 6-week process with this editor, I felt like the book was ready to submit. And the way that process works for fiction is you have to have an agent. So I went through the process of sending out letters to agents. It's called a query letter, Query. And it's a sort of standard letter. It's usually an introduction about yourself and then a short sort of paragraph about the book. And then kind of like a closing paragraph, and you can email that to agents, and wait. You basically wait. It's a waiting game then, and waiting to see who's interested to get back to you.
Wow. So how many agents did you end up emailing, or like how did you even find contacts for those agents?
Yeah, so there's a great resource online called Query Tracker. So again, Query Tracker. You just type that into Google, and it's a database of agents and the genres that they represent. So genre is everything. So the first thing you have to do when you have your manuscript is decide what genre it's in. And then you're going to try to find agents that are looking for that type of material to represent. And so, agents that represent romance novels, for example, generally do not also represent horror or sci-fi, right? Like they usually like break out into groups. So usually romance and women's fiction, sci-fi and speculative fiction, young adult and middle grade fiction. So you'll want to try to generate a list of agents who are in your genre. And then you can go to a website called Manuscript Wishlist, which is where agents list the type of books that they like. So they're listing, I'm looking for the next Crazy Rich Asians, for example. If you feel like your books may be a good match for them, that's probably a good person to send your letter to. So I did that. And I probably submitted queries to about like a total of about 20 agents. And what I did was I made a list of like 5 to 8 at a time. What you don't want to do is like get a list of 100 agents and then send them all your material all at the same time. Because if you get rejected, you're like kind of stuck then, because there's a finite number of agents, especially depending what genre you're in. If you're in a genre like sci-fi, for example, there just aren't a lot of agents that represent that genre. So you want to be judicious about the way that you approach agents. So I would send out my letter to like 5 or 8 agents at a time and then wait for them to get back to me. And a lot of agents are very generous with their feedback. A lot of them would write back and say, this book I like the idea, but I just felt like your first 5 pages, which is usually what you send, the first 5 pages or 10 pages, whatever they ask for on their website. They would write back and say, I liked the main character, but just something about the story isn't working for me. Or I like the story, but the character isn't working for me. And if you hear the same feedback from, let's say, 5 out of 8 editors, that you have work to do. So I took that as feedback. And then after that, all of those rejections came back. I sat down and went, okay, what can I do to make my submission stronger? So do I have to rewrite the beginning of the book? Do I have to work on my main character? And for me, it was working on my main character, it was working on the voice of her first person narrative voice. So I went back and did that. And then when I was done doing that, I sent letters out to the next 5 or 8 agents. So I wasn't burning through my whole agent list. So I feel like that's a valuable tip.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought about that. And it sounds like the online community is really big for kind of how you found everything, like this query. I guess, is there like one website that kind of led you to all the others, or was it just kind of like using the online community? And yeah.
I'm like cringing when I say this, but it's Twitter, believe it or not. And I wasn't,
Wow.
right? I wasn't on Twitter at all before I was like ready to, to try to get my book published. But there is a huge writing community on Twitter, and it is like, I just accidentally muted myself. Sorry. There's a huge writing community on Twitter, and, I try not to get like sucked into the social media, vortex, but, judicious use of Twitter is probably a good idea if you're at that stage. That's where I discovered the RevPick contest. That was that developmental editing contest. Had I not been on Twitter, I would not have seen that.
Wow. Yeah, Twitter, I mean, it's good for a couple of things, but it can definitely suck you in.
It's like horrible and like super valuable at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, even for like promotions, like, do you use it now for like promoting your book?
I've pretty much stepped away from it because it was such a time suck. So yeah, now I find it less useful now. I think I don't know that any social media is really very helpful for book promotion. I think it's more word of mouth and then whatever the publisher does.
Okay. Yeah.
Or so like Book Talk, but I think you have to be like a lot younger than I am to be on Book Talk. I don't think TikTok.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I am either.
I don't think I'm welcome there. I feel like yeah, I'm just like too awkward to be on TikTok.
How does it look like after? So now you found your agent, and then like what are the steps, or how long did it even take after that? Because it sounded like finding an agent is such a process, and then
so publishing is a long game for sure. Everything takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. So just to hear back from agents can take, average like 3 to 6 months, and that's just normal. I actually got a rejection from an agent a year and a half after my book was accepted for publication. And it was like, like a query letter I had sent like years before. But that's just kind of the way the industry works. So I sold my book in 2018, and the book came out in 2020. So it was an almost 2-year time period from when I actually signed the contract to when the book actually hit shelves. And again, it's just, the industry just kind of moves slowly.
Yeah. So does the agent then find the people to sell it to, or when you sell it to the agent, they just guarantee you that it gets published then?
Yeah, so the agent is like a partner. So the agent doesn't make any money until they sell your book. So, I signed with my agent, and then she made a list. She basically does her own query process where she makes a list of 10 editors that she thinks would be interested at the various publishing houses, and then sends the book to those 10 people, and then we wait. And that process can take, mine, I was really lucky. Mine actually took 6 weeks to find an editor to buy the book, which is like lightning speed for the industry. But I've had friends who've waited 6 months or a year before really hearing back from everybody. And if, no editors are interested at that point, then you send the book out to another 10 and so on. But yeah, I was lucky with my first round. We heard back from Penguin, who was interested, and yeah. And then it was that 2-year wait until the book came out, but still.
No, that's so amazing though. Do you have any advice or tips for people who are interested in like just getting started in writing a book, or like have an idea and are like trying to think about the genre or just enjoy it in general?
Yeah, no, I have so much advice. Yeah, I think, so one, I would say that if you're interested in writing a book and getting it published, like if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's just, I think it just takes patience. And I think a lot of people just get discouraged by the wait time, the time it takes to hear back from agents and all of the rejection and everything. But I think if you are someone who loves writing and you're committed to working to be a better writer and you're open to feedback, then definitely, it's certainly an achievable goal and something that you should keep working towards. I think as far as like the writing goes, something that really helped me was learning the difference between good writing and good storytelling. So I think there's a difference between being good stylistically, so knowing how to put together a beautiful sentence or a really good synonym or something like that, and knowing how to tell a story in a way that's going to keep the reader interested. And those are two totally different skill sets, both totally learnable things, but very different. So there are a lot of style books, like Stephen King has a style book called On Writing, which is great. And there are tons of, authors that have written style books about, how to write a beautiful sentence or a beautiful paragraph. And there are fewer books about how to tell a good story. And Margaret Atwood has this great analogy where she describes what good storytelling is. And she says, if you wanted to write Little Red Riding Hood, for example, you could start this story by saying, one day, Little Red Riding Hood decided to go to her grandmother's house. And she got a picnic basket and she packed it with some bread and some fruit and some cake or whatever. And then she went out the door, and little did she know there was danger lurking in the forest. And that's pretty good. Or you could start the story like this: it was dark inside the wolf. And which one is better, right? So the same story, but you've told it in two completely different ways. And I love that analogy because I think that hits it right on the head, that there is a technique to storytelling, and there's a way that that established novelists do it, and it's learnable. And the book that I recommend if you're interested in learning how to do it is this one. It's called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is a really bizarre name, but Save the Cat is a screenwriting technique. So it originally developed by screenwriters to plot out the story for a movie. And that technique can be applied to novel writing as well. And it does sound a little formulaic, like you start with, your main character, and then XYZ happens to your main character. And by 50% through, you should have, so many things have happened, and you've set up, the things that are going to happen in the last half of the book. But it's genius and it works. And if you read, some of the most popular books like Harry Potter, for example, like follow this same structure, and it doesn't feel formulaic, but it is. But I highly recommend people who don't love the idea of formula. I think, I know writers who don't love that idea, but still use this technique in some form to plot out novels. So that's probably my most valuable piece of writing advice is to learn how to do that. Yeah.
I think you're so right about the storytelling. Like, storytelling is such a technique, and yeah, there's so much art to telling a story, and
it's totally learnable, right? It's like,
that's so
absolutely
cool that it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's totally learnable. And like, once you know what the steps are, every time you watch a movie, every time you read a book, you're going, oh, that's that point in the story. And they have like different terms that they call them. They call it like the moment towards the end where there's like a crisis is called like the moment of no return or something like that. So like whenever I watch a movie, I'll be like, oh, that's their moment of no return. Because like what you're talking about is taking this main character on a journey where like they grow, right? They're here and then they make bad decisions and then they grow. And there's like certain points along that path that most, if not all, like popular fiction and movies follow. So it's neat. Like once you know to recognize it, you can kind of tell where the story is going.
Yeah. I can like totally tell you're passionate about it, and that makes me like so excited about it too.
Yeah, I feel like it's like this secret that nobody talks about, because I feel like, you know, when you take writing courses, the focus, even like MFA courses, I've had friends who've done MFA courses, so Masters in Fine Arts, which is like the degree for novel writers. I have not done that, but I know people who have who complain that a lot of MFA courses focus on style and really not on the plotting and the storytelling technique. So yeah, I feel like I want to share that with everybody.
Oh yeah, totally appreciate it. You're like giving us the inside scoop. How do you balance like your medical career and also being an author? Does it take up a lot of your time, or like do you kind of like segment stuff a lot?
Yeah. So, when I was writing the White Coat Diaries, I was working full time, and I had first one kid and then the second child. And it was tough. It took a really long time. It took me 8 years to finish this book. And I just kind of did it in 5-minute increments. So, I would go to the car line to pick up my child from school. And in that 5 or 10 minutes, I'd have my laptop with me and I, write a couple of sentences. And, that's just what I did for years. But not because it was work, because I enjoyed it. Like at that time I had no idea if this book was going to be sellable. It seemed kind of like a far-fetched idea. There's not a lot of medical fiction out there. And I was just doing it for me. So, I just fit it in when I could. Now, 8 years later and a book contract later, I have deadlines. So now I try to structure it, and, I'm really lucky. I'm not doing it alone. I have a super supportive spouse. I'm blessed and lucky to have reliable childcare so that I can carve out time to write. So I usually do like 1 or 2 days a week of like 6-hour blocks of time where I can write. So that's my schedule now.
Okay, yeah. So it did get like a little bit more structured, but it wasn't in the beginning as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you have future plans as an author? Speaking of like carving out time.
Yeah, I mean, I have a book coming out in April. So my second book, which is called At Least You Have Your Health, which is about a gynecologist. And in 2023, a third book coming out, which is about 2 sisters who are on a worldwide trip to find their mother who's gone missing. And then after that, I'm not sure. I kind of just I'm in the process of writing that third book and, trying to find the time to do it. It's been rough with the pandemic and the kids virtually schooling and stuff. So I'm just like hoping I'll make the deadline for that.
2 in the pipeline is really great though. That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel really lucky. I mean, it's something I love to do, and it's exciting to be able to share it with people.
With the sequential books, do you like sell the idea first and then you write, and like they're basically like purchasing?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. So some writers, when they sell their first book, let's say the book is part of a series, then they're selling that, that first book as well as the concept for a second and third and however many, books. And so those are called multi-book contracts. Mine for White Coat was just a 1-book contract. It was just for the 1 book. But probably I think it was last summer. No, maybe 2 summers ago. I sold the second book to them just based on an outline. I had written out, an outline for this second book about the gynecologist, and they it wasn't actually about the guy. It was the one about the sisters. And I submitted that to them. And that's part of the contract, is that any new material that you write, you've agreed to show that to this publishing company that you've signed with. And they don't have to buy it. They can take a pass on that, but they want to see it first. So that's called an option. So as part of the option for my contract, I had to show them this new idea I was working on, and they, fortunately, they liked it and they wanted to buy it, but they said that they actually came to me and said, we like that book about the sisters, but we would like you to write a book about a doctor who's a mom. That was just something they were looking for. And they said, we want you to write that next and then write the book about the sisters. So they gave me like 48 hours to come up with a plot and an outline. And I spent like a day, taking long walks around my neighborhood and talking out ideas with my husband. And we came up with this idea of this gynecologist who goes to work for a wellness company that's kind of one of those companies that sells crystals and does vitamin infusions and stuff like that. And she is hired to do house calls for very wealthy women in a suburb as their staff gynecologist, and the things that happen. So I wrote up this outline for this story, and fortunately they liked that. So that's how I ended up selling book 2 and 3 to them.
Oh, that's so awesome. Wow. Yeah, wait, I'm kind of excited for that book to come out too. You said April, right?
Yeah, April. I'm really proud of that book. It's very different from the White Coat Diaries. I just kind of went off in a different direction, and I feel like my writing evolves as I work on it. And yeah, I think it's a pretty fun book.
Awesome. I'll keep my eye open for it. I can see that there's some Q&A, and I think that we got all of my questions, so I don't want to steal all of your time, so we can open it up to the Q&A. But thank you so much. It was so nice to talk with you, Maddie.
Oh, thank you, Maria. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maddie and Maria. That was super insightful. So many good tips out of that. I know I was writing some down and I didn't even know I wanted to become an author, but now you
do.
That was wonderful.
So great.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I want to encourage our audience, right now is our Q&A portion of the program. So if you haven't yet done so yet, go ahead and use that Q&A button at the bottom. The bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can tonight. We still have about 20 minutes or so, but we did have a number of questions come through on the registration, so I'll get us started with a couple of those. So the first group of them deal with a little bit more about the writing process. So do you know if there are any ghostwriters for those working in the medical field? I know medical fiction's a unique group. But
yeah. So not that I know of. I don't know of any ghostwriting situation for fiction other than if you're an ex-president or a celebrity of some kind.
Got it. All right. Good to know. And your book is loosely based on your own experience. So anything that you can share on, how to get, approval on using those characters? Did you go to your former colleagues and share hey, I'm going to share our story? Kind of, how did that work?
Yeah, so I didn't check with anybody, or I didn't even tell anybody I was working on a novel until it literally hit the shelves, because I wasn't sure that it was going to work out. But the novel in its final form is so loosely based on reality that some of the situations are certainly based on real life, but the people, they're kind of mishmashes of different people that I met along the way. So I didn't feel like I was going to, out anybody, or, that people were going to read the book and be like, oh, I think that's me. I didn't feel like anything was that close to reality that I'd have to worry about that. I had to reassure my mom that the mom character is not her. So I had to do a little bit of that, but other than that, no.
Yeah. And you kind of talked about, when you started, you were thinking you were going to write a memoir, and then it kind of changed into a novel. Did it ever go through your mind, I don't really want to face any legal ramifications, so I'm going to make this fiction? Or was that just not even a thought?
That's a really good question. I don't think I worried so much about the legal stuff because the hospital doesn't exist anymore. I think that if the hospital was there and I was using its name, or just thinly veiled, its name, I would have been more worried. But because it was so long ago, and there's no one to get mad at this point. Yeah, I could just say what happened there.
Very interesting. Thank you. So kind of, you already, talked a lot about the tools that you were able to use to kind of help further your process. But how did you find inspiration? What are some sources that you go to make this enjoyable? Because it's not your full-time gig; it's your passion. So where are your inspiration from?
So I get a lot of inspiration from, believe it or not, from podcasts. So if I'm looking for like a story idea or an interesting character idea, I love podcasts like This American Life, for example, because I do a lot of commuting to and from work and to and from soccer practice and that sort of thing. So I'm able to listen to podcasts in the car, and there have been a lot of like little story ideas that I've picked up just from listening to that. So there was a great podcast that I listened to a couple years ago called S-Town, which is about this guy, really famous podcast about this guy who it's a conspiracy theorist. And there were a couple like little tidbits from there that I actually used in this book that's coming out in April. So definitely was inspiration.
Wonderful. Speaking of other podcasts, we have a fan of the Dr. Death podcasts, and wanted to know if you'd ever, explore maybe a medical thriller.
I love that Dr. Death podcast. I like blew through the first season of that in the car and like was mad when my commute was over because it was so good. I just don't see myself as a thriller writer, but I guess I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I'm just interested in any interesting story. So if I could come up with like an interesting, creepy character, sure, I'd write a story about that. That sounds interesting to me.
There we go. There's a little nugget planned.
Yeah, keep that in mind.
That's wonderful. And, your next book is about an OBGYN, and the book after that about the sisters, does it have a medical tie to it, or
one of the characters is a doctor, but it doesn't really, that's not really part of the story. And I didn't really intentionally step away from writing about medicine, but it just wasn't part of the story that I wanted to tell.
Got it. Okay. So, and the next set of questions I kind of want to dive into are just some logistical questions. So first off, how do you protect your work? How do you copyright it? Like, what does that process look like?
So it's easy for me because I'm with a traditional publisher. And one thing that we didn't really touch on earlier is the difference between traditional publishing and self-publishing. I don't know much about the self-publishing side, but I do know that if you are going to go that route, that you will have to sort of, be aware of your copyright and sort of take more responsibility for that. With traditional publishing, because I'm with a big publishing house, they take care of all of that for me. So I'm lucky in that sense. I don't have much creative control over the book once it's done, once I'm done writing it. But the plus side to traditional publishing is that I don't have to think too much about the legal stuff.
Great. And another kind of logistical question. So when you sell your books, do you sell the rights to them for, print and digital and potentially a movie or a TV series?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So movie and TV are completely separate situations. So when you sell the book, you're just selling the actual text of the book for ebooks, the print book, and an audiobook, should they choose to make an audiobook. And that's it. So the movie rights and TV rights are actually handled completely separate from the publishing company. They are handled through your agencies. That's the other reason that it's important when you're writing fiction to have an agent. If you are interested in, maybe having your book made into a TV show or movie, you're going to want an agency that handles that. Most agencies do. And I'm lucky enough that the White Coat Diaries was optioned for television development. And that happened through my agency. Producer reached out to my agent asking for a copy of the book, and it kind of like went from there. So yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. So the next question is, down to the nitty gritty. What are some of the fees associated with writing a book and getting it published?
So with traditional publishing, if you're with a big publisher, even an independent publisher, there should be no fees at all for you as the author. You should pay nothing. When you sign with your agent, again, you're still not going to pay anything. And then when you sell the book to your publisher, you'll get an advance. So your agent will negotiate for you an advance on the book. And then you sign a contract for royalties on the book, which would be like a percentage of the number of books you sold. There are some small, what we call vanity presses out there, which will charge you to publish your book. I generally recommend staying away from that sort of thing. I think there are a lot of, unsavory publishing companies out there that want to take advantage of writers. You'll sell your book to them and, pay them a fee, and they may or may not do anything for you in terms of, producing an actual product or, promoting it or anything. So that's what I know just from hearing about it.
That's really helpful. I think that's kind of a good insider's tip for sure. So for the writing process, this book, The White Coat Diaries, went through some different iterations. Was it hard to let go of any versions or kind of let go of, a format or a character or whatever you had in some of your first drafts?
For sure. There were scenes that I wanted to include that either my editor or my agent thought weren't the best. And I went through that painful process of, having to delete, pages that I really loved, that I spent a long time working on. But, in the end, I realized that they had my best interest at heart. And I'm grateful for that feedback. I think it's always hard to hear negative feedback about your work, but that's just part of growing as a writer. So I always try to take a moment to, say goodbye to that part of the book and then copy it into another document, because just in case I want to use it later, it's never really gone. And I really took to heart the advice of my editor. She's, been doing this a long time. She knows what she's doing. So I trusted her.
Great. And Penguin's your publisher. So your editor or your agent helped you find the editor at Penguin, right? And yep. Do you have any friends in the industry who had multiple options of different publishers, and how do you pick one if you do have multiples?
So when your agent makes that list of, 10 or so publishers to send your book out to, if you end up getting offers from more than one, it'll go to auction, which means that both, let's say that there's two editors. I mean, sometimes it's all 10 of them, are trying to get your book, which is great because, then there'll be an auction with, a 10-way auction. But usually it's two or three. And then, it usually comes down to your agent getting the best deal for you. So, they'll negotiate things like the advance and your royalty percentage and where the book will be placed in the market. So, some books will get a lot of publicity and be lead titles that season. Publishing's big on seasons. It's a fall season of books and a spring season of books. So your agent will negotiate for you, things like, where your title is going to be placed and how much publicity it'll get, whether or not you'll get a hardcover, which is always something that most authors want. So things like that. So usually that's how you decide who you're going to go with.
Okay. That's really interesting. And speaking of the publishing process, do you know if it's different, for fiction versus nonfiction, or if you're working with different audiences like young adult or children versus, adult?
So the process is definitely different for nonfiction. So with fiction, you have to have a complete manuscript in order to do anything, in order to, to reach out to agents. Your work has to be done. And that's the same for children's books. I'm not sure if it's a little bit different for picture books. With picture books, you do not have to have illustrations. You can just submit picture book text, assuming that has to be pretty well finished. For nonfiction, it's totally different. You can sell a nonfiction book based on just a book proposal, and sometimes just a book proposal in a chapter or two. So in your letter to the agent, you would say, here's the book that I want to write, and here's what I'm proposing, and here's why I'm an authority on this subject. And you might be able to, the agent can take that book proposal and then turn around and sell that to a publisher without you having really written very much.
And, speaking of a proposal, for your second book, you had submitted an outline, right, to kind of have that picked up. Did that look like a proposal, or what's the difference, between the two?
So I'm not sure exactly what a nonfiction book proposal looks like, because I've never done one, but I think it's probably pretty similar to the type of outline that I wrote for that second book. The outline I wrote for the second book was, what I thought the title might be, which always changes. So that's not super important. Who I thought the main character would be, and then just a very rough kind of in the first part of the book, this is what happens. And then the second part of the book, that's what happens. And here's how it ends. And it was like maybe like a page and a half. So yeah, really brief.
And the next group of questions, we've gotten a few from the Q&A, and they're all kind of about your writing process, or just writing in general. So, the first one I want to ask, as related to storytelling versus style, what was your first line you wrote for this book? And did you rewrite that, over and over again? Did it have a lot of changes?
That's a great question. So actually, the only thing that didn't change about this book was the first line. The first line is, I just want to help people. Because it's like this cliche thing that med students say, like, in your interviews, when you're interviewing for med school, they'll ask you, why do you want to be a doctor? And like every single person will say, I just want to help people. So I started the book like that. And that's the only part of the book that didn't change, was that first scene where she's sitting in the closet, kind of reevaluating her life choices. And then everything after that, I rewrote like a bunch of times.
It's a pretty strong opener.